You know, doing better than others in worship is kind of the motivation behind our text. The desire. That's the desire of the Samaritan woman here. She's been caught out with her sin, with these men. Trying to draw attention away from that, she wants to somehow come across as superior to the Jews. That's what this is. That's the essence behind this text. This desire to compare ourselves with each other so that I'm one up above you, or you're one up above me, especially as it relates to them in worship. There was a study done. I used this several years ago, but I thought it was a study that would be interesting to bring back up again. There was a study done at Harvard several years ago where they asked the students these questions, and this was the question: which would you prefer, a job where you made $50,000 a year? That's option B. This is years ago. $50,000 a year, that's option A. Or where you made $100,000 a year, that's option B. So this is several years ago. So now it's easy, right? You know which one you're going to choose. You got a choice of $50,000 or $100,000. You're going to take the $100,000. So everyone should take option B, but then there was a catch. In option A, the students would get paid twice as much as others who would only get $25,000. So you would make $50,000, but everybody else that would work with you would only make $25,000. In option B, they would get paid $100,000, but all the other people that you would work with would be paid $200,000. So option B would make the students more money overall, but they would be doing worse than all of their friends around them. What do you think the majority chose? They chose option A. Even though they weren't making as much money, they would be making twice as much money as everybody around them. We want to compare and look good. Even in our worship, we may compare our worship with theirs to be better. It's not really a wise thing to do a lot of comparing. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves among themselves and are not wise. It's not wise to do that. It's actually a sign of weakness. We must humbly realize that God, as a good Father, loves us for us and not for what we've done or for our abilities or our intelligence or our righteousness or our worship, but as a good Father loves his children. Someone said, we dare not compare ourselves to anyone, for we are all one of a kind. Someone else said, I need to just be me. Everyone else is already taken anyway. Someone else said, we should not compare our worship to theirs, for we never know the truth about anyone else but us, and we are sometimes wrong about us. It can be serious, a very serious thing, to compare your worship with someone else's. Now, it's not, the idea of doing it is not, but our reaction to it can be very serious. A good example of that is Genesis chapter 4, verses 4 through 5, where Abel offered an offering to the Lord, and Cain offered an offering to the Lord. In verse 4 it says, the Lord respected Abel and his offering. Okay. Verse 5, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. Cain didn't really give it his all, I guess. Didn't do it right. And then it says, and Cain was very angry. Ended up killing his brother over it. So comparing your worship with someone else actually could be dangerous. In Mythical Me, Rochella Parman begins by telling of a single event that led her down a particular journey on this, how she compared herself, particularly with other women. And so she wrote about that. She said that she had gone to this ladies' retreat-like thing, and when she came home, she's talking to her husband about her ladies' retreat. She said, well, Belinda is so kind and friendly. I wish I had her sense of humor. Then she switched. I wish I could be more like Anne. She's incredibly organized. And then she changed. She says, boy, it would be nice to be like Shannon. She's so poised and beautiful. I wish I had her posture and carriage. Her husband, been listening to this the whole time, interrupted her and said, Rochella, you compare yourself with everyone you meet. You pick out the best attributes of each person and measure how you stack up against them. Now that already rankled her. By the way, gentlemen, don't generally interrupt your wife when she's talking like this. So she's already a little rankled, and then what he said next really upset her. He said, you've created for yourself a mythical composite woman, and you think she's the standard you should meet. But that woman, ladies, does not exist. You're fine like you are. Some compare with others. Churches. Did you know that? Well, I had this experience over here. I had this one. So they compare the preachers. Please don't do that. Or the singing. Please don't do that. Or the programs. Please don't do that. You start comparing because ultimately, if you're not careful, the motivation behind that is to belittle one and exalt another. Especially if they're just trying to please the Lord. It's a dangerous path. And I'm certainly not worthy to be on the group to be compared. I'm just one of you standing up here. So in our text, Jesus uses four antithetical, well, antithetical means basically directly opposed or contrasted shifts in just a few words. So we want to look at just those few words. It's a really simple lesson. We're going to look at just a few of those concepts, and then the lesson will be yours. Stop. Oh, there we go. Number one, on versus in. Now, that's not as significant in the Greek, by the way, but that's the way your versions predominantly translate it. On this mountain versus in Jerusalem. In John chapter 4, he says in verses 20, he says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, and you Jews say that it's in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah is the place where one ought to worship. On versus in. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. On a mountain versus in a temple. You know, some think it's on a river or a lake or a mountain versus in a church building, especially with half the lights off. Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2 says, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple, as if Jesus need his disciples to show him the buildings of the temple. Verse 2, and Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? That's an interesting question. Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. And if you see a picture of it today, you know that was fulfilled. Not one stone left upon another. You know, it's funny. Places nor the beauty of a facility are to be used as a comparison. Hope I got your attention. It's dangerous for us right now in this building to do just that. Jesus used an antithetical shift in our thinking, on versus in, and he rejects them both. Number next, you versus we. He does something interesting here. You worship what you do not know versus we know what we worship. John chapter 4 verse 22 says, you worship what you do not know. We know, we know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. You do not know versus we know. You versus we. You versus we. Some think it's you versus me or we. That somehow one of us is special. It knows stuff the others don't know. It's got a special connection the rest of us don't have. Like somehow you're special the way you worship, but I'm not. Or I'm special the way I worship, but you're not. So I make a connection and you don't, or you make a connection and I don't. You ever been talked to like that? Been talked to like that many times. You, we. Ephesians 2, verse 14. The theme of the scriptures is this: for he himself, that is Jesus, is our peace, who hath made both one. The you and the we are one now. And has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity that is in the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man, that is, Jew, Gentile. There's no two different people now. From the two, thus making peace. Verse 16, that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross. This is the one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who are far off and to those who are near. Verse 18 finally says this: for through him we, not just you and me, you versus we, but we together both have access by one Spirit. You see, races, that's what we're talking about in this text. The Samaritans versus the Jews. It's basically two different races of people, two different cultures. Races, nor special access to certain places are to be used as a comparison. It's dangerous for us because what it does is it limits our unity. And there's not to be a limit to our unity. Jesus said, as an antithetical shift in his thinking, you versus we is going away. It's going away. Why do we keep using it? And then it's in versus in. Did you pick up on that? There's an in versus in. It's not so critical in the Greek, but it's obviously in the English. In Jerusalem versus in spirit and truth. There is a shift coming. In Jerusalem versus in spirit and truth. That's what he brings up in verses 21 and 23. It says in 21, Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither worship on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. Verse 23, but the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. Verses in Jerusalem being that special place, to in spirit being that special place, and in truth. So in a Jewish temple versus in spirit and truth and in your heart. Some still think it's in a place or in a group, that real worship only happens in a certain place or in a certain group. Be careful. And not in spirit and truth. Because if it's in spirit and truth, you can't tell all that's doing that. And you have no knowledge of it. Because spirit's not something we can see. Philippians chapter 3, verses 2 through 8. I'll just spot read here, beginning in verse 3. For we are the circumcision who worship God in spirit and rejoice in Christ Jesus and have no confidence in the flesh. That's big stuff there if you really listen to what he's saying. Verse 4, though I also might have confidence in the flesh, if anyone else thinks he may have confidence in the flesh, I more so. Circumcised, a Hebrew, a Pharisee, blameless. Verse 7, but what things were gained to me, these I've counted loss for Christ. Yet indeed, I also count all things lost for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus, my Lord. It's not the flesh, it's not the nation, and it's not the sect. It's not the culture, it's not the place. America's not the haven. There is no place like that. And we are not to use such as comparisons. It's dangerous to think that we do the true worship as if it's something we do. The problem with that is we think that's corporate. And yes, we're to worship corporately. But what happens in this room may not have any bearing on what happens within inside of you. So it's dangerous to think, well, I'm in the right group and we're all doing it the right way, and so everything's honky-dory. When your mind hadn't been on anything we've talked about this morning, and right now you can't stand what's going on and you can't wait to get out of this room. So don't tell me, well, I'm in the Church of Christ, we do it. Has nothing to do with that. It's what's going on inside of you. See, that's where it happens. There's not a place. It's not over here in this building or that building. So what are you doing? Where you are. Well, we do it right over here. Well, great. That's wonderful. But do you do it right over there? In versus in. So Jesus uses an antithetical shift in our thinking from in versus in. You thought it was in here? It's not in here, it's in here. So it's will versus must. In John chapter 4, verses 23 through 24, he compares will, which is a command to do his will versus must. Now must, if you do it, it's a must to you, then it has something to do with something that happened inside of you, a changed heart, a changed mindset. Listen to me read it again. Verse 23. See, familiar passages should be read more closely, don't you think? Verse 23, but the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father. It hadn't happened quite yet, but it's right there at the verge. We'll talk about that in a minute. Will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. Verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. There's an urgency within the true worshipers. I don't know if you're getting it. So there's the will worship, the ones that do it because it's commanded. And then there's another kind of worshiper. You must do it. I've got to do this. Some think it's will worship commandments and not changed hearts. But Colossians 2, verse 20 says, if you be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances, touch not, taste not, handle not, which are, listen to this statement, which all are to perish. At some point, you shift from being a commandment keeper to someone who must do the right thing, who must worship God, which all are to perish with the using after the commandments and doctrines of men, which things are indeed a show of wisdom and will worship and humility and neglect of the body, but not in any honor to the satisfying of the flesh. It really doesn't have anything to do with your heart. You can keep the commandments and it never be a changed heart. You can do it. I've done it. You can do it. Not wills or commands versus sincerity. And that even shouldn't be a comparison. It's dangerous. It's dangerous because then now I'm comparing myself with you. It's actually dangerous. He's doing it because it's the will of God, and I'm doing it because of a changed heart. Now it's back to what I was condemning at the beginning of this lesson. It's back to, nah, boo-boo, I can worship better than you can. Or we do it right, and y'all don't do it right over yonder. That's the whole lesson. Are we so focused on comparisons? And I know probably nobody here does that. Y'all don't compare yourself. You don't even compare what they're wearing versus what you're wearing. That doesn't happen here. But over at that other church where they do that, because they're just not as good as us. Have we so focused on comparisons to make sure that we're right and others are wrong? Because we got to go to heaven, and we don't care if they'd make it, but we're going to go to heaven. That we've missed the simplicity of just worshiping God in spirit. Some still think it's on a river or a lake or a mountain, and that's where I really worship God. Some think it's only in a church. Some think it's you versus we. And we're special and we know stuff and you don't. Some think it's in a place or in a group or even in a race for that matter. And we're the ones who are in spirit and in truth. Some think it's will worshiping those commands and getting them right versus a changed spirit and a heart that's in it. Are not all churches subject to this? And I'm using that in the broadest sense of the term church. Are not all churches competitive? And aren't you what we're competing for? Is that not it? Isn't that what it kind of feels like? We're all just competing for you. You're the customers. Isn't that kind of disgusting? Doesn't that feel wrong? Church is subject to this competitive thing, so we've got to have a better sign than everybody else. We've got to have a better worship than everybody else. We'll gather them more, but we get the right guy up there in the pulpit. Boy, I've heard this said so many times, which one day you'll have the right guy, I'm sure. But one day when we get that right guy, then we're just going to explode. We're going to do stuff then to win, because ultimately what we're now talking about is I got to win. I got to win. And not that because my team's going to win. We're back to rooting for a football team instead of church. Be the only ones right. To get the people on our side. Why not just try to get on God's side and His Spirit and His truth? You know, comparing doesn't actually always work. It doesn't always tell you something. Really doesn't always tell you anything. So you can compare apples and oranges, but you don't always tell you something. For example, my wife has survived 3 C-sections. Okay? I might say I've survived 3 C-sections too. They were traumatic for me as well. So what were they like? Well, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty here, but I'll give you a little bit. Our first child was Heath. He was a problem. And so we had to have an emergency C-section. We didn't know this was going to happen. It was an emergency C-section, and so she was asleep. So I got to see ugly little old Heath first. And she was like 2-3 hours later before she woke up to see him. Well, that's one C-section. Second C-section was the easiest C-section of all for mama and for baby. Okay? I was sick. I had the flu or something, strep throat or something. I was feeling miserable. But it all went well other than the blood. It was great. Third C-section. Mama nearly died. I nearly died. Bethany was fine. She's great. What did I learn from all that? Absolutely nothing. Nothing. Except that I'm glad they're all alive. They're all healthy. I didn't learn anything. And comparing them doesn't make any sense at all. I love each one of them. I'm grateful my wife's around. And so this idea of, well, comparison will teach you something. No, it doesn't. It doesn't always teach you anything. So you're busy comparing everything. Some of you compare everything. Everything is a competition. Everything is a comparison. Please understand, that's not wise. You know, it's not always beneficial. In 1975, a fellow named Charlie Chapman was still alive. Charlie Chapman was still alive in 1975, and he decided he was in France, and he decided he'd enter a look-alike contest for Charlie Chapman. He came in third. He enjoyed it. He didn't look like Charlie Chapman. Imagine if Jesus were here today, which church would he worship at? Is that where we're at? Would he decide we weren't doing right? It's funny how we go down that pathway, isn't it? We have to be the winners. Focus on worshiping God. Oh, I need to tell you about who the true worshipers are. You want to know who they are? Do you want to know? I bet you don't. You see, you read this passage all your life, right? And you thought you knew what it's talking about. It's talking about us, our church. Well, actually, in a vague way, in a very serious way, it's not. You see, the first true worshiper went on the Mount of Olives, separated from the 12, then separated from the 3, and went out all by himself. Then in tears and agony, he knelt down and he began true worship. And what is true worship? I don't want this. I don't like what's happening in my life right now, Father. Please don't let this happen. But you're still my God, and I will do whatever you want me to do. That's true worship, but it's not true worship until you actually do it. And so he walked up Golgotha's hill, and he laid down on that rugged cross, and they nailed him to it. That's true worship. How does yours compare? You sure you want to compare? Because all this other stuff is not really true worship. That's it. Serving the Lord when it makes you miserable, and you do it anyway. You didn't think it was going there, did you? So this invitation is for all of you who think life is wonderful and you've never had trouble, to be a true worshiper, to follow the Lord when it makes you miserable. Serve Him with all your heart anyway. Repenting of your sins, confessing the name of Christ, and being baptized. If that's the call you're willing to listen to, then the invitation is yours while we stand and while we sing.